So what we're going to be talking about, how do we stop the inflation? This is not suspenseful. We're going to give away the show. It's dump the bonds, dump the debt, and dump the plutocracy. So let me clean up my screen a little here. So what is inflating? Now, obviously, inflation at the moment is a worldwide phenomenon. To start with, we're going to concentrate on the United States just because, the United States is the center of, controlling center of the world economy. And it's been a lot easier for me to find good statistics for the United States than for the world. So if you look at the budget that the working class is paying in the United States, the first number you see is how much each item contributes to the budget. So here in the States, obviously, the biggest item in everybody's budget is housing. And housing has been rising tremendously rapidly. House prices are up 22%. Now, obviously, not everybody is paying that because houses are turning over relatively slowly, but housing and rent is rising extremely rapidly. Transportation is next. Energy, 20% and up 20% per year, then followed by food and health. And the reason I've emphasized housing and energy in red is it's obvious if you multiply these two numbers together, it's clear that something like 85% of US inflation is due to the increase in the cost of housing and the increase in the cost of energy. If we take the world as a whole, obviously things like food are going to be much more important because in most of the world, food is a much more significant part of the budget. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on housing and energy. So let's take housing first. Why is housing inflating? Well, this is really, really easy to answer. This is a nice graph of the market share of housing that's being bought by investors, not people who want to live in these houses, but people who want to take these houses and resell them for higher. Generally, of course, keeping them off the market in the meantime. And if you look down at the bottom for the years, you see the big rises. Obviously, there's a general upward trend since the beginning of the century, but the big rises are in the period 2009 to 2012, a little rise in 2016, and then an enormously rapid rise during the last 2 years, the pandemic and following. So now it's at a record level of 20%. And obviously, it's not very difficult to see that when a huge fraction of the market is speculative, where people are buying houses and institutions are buying houses to make a profit, that enormously increases the rate of rise of the prices. Now, where did the money come from? Well, the money is coming from the Fed. So remember what I just said about 2009 to 2012. This is a graph of the corporate bonds that have been purchased total, it's a running total, by the Fed, starting in the program in 2009. So in 2009, there was a huge run-up of more than $1 trillion, which corresponds to that first period of rapid rise. And there was another rapid rise in 2013. And of course, an even more rapid rise, this absolutely straight up rise of almost $2 trillion in the period since the beginning of the pandemic, leveling off just at the beginning of this year, that little flat part. So what is this? Well, first of all, these are euphemistically called government-backed mortgage bonds, government-backed. These are bonds that are issued by banks. These are loans from the United States government to banks, and the banks in turn lend money on, these are packaged mortgages. But this is a straight subsidy. This is bonds that no one else will purchase, that the government has purchased to prevent a meltdown in the market, repeatedly intervening, obviously the first time in the crash of 09, of 08, 09. They thought they could level off, but they had to continue that a few years later, and then again in the crisis beginning in March of 2020. So this is $3 trillion that has been transferred from the federal government to the banks. Now, how does that money flow into the housing market? Well, just briefly, US Federal Reserve funds are now financing approximately 100% of all corporate bonds. Now remember, what they're buying is bonds from the financial sector. So those are bank bonds. But the banks then have turned around and lent that money to other corporations. So this graph shows the orange line. You can see there are a lot of fluctuations here, are total sales of all corporate bonds since the crash of 08. And these add up to about $3 trillion. And this is the rate, trillions of dollars per year, the blue line, of the flow of money from the Fed to banks. So this is simply the rate of increase of that last curve. So again, we see the big boost in 09 through 012, a smaller boost in 013 through 015, and then this very sharp boost beginning in 2020. So basically, the amount of money that the corporations have borrowed is entirely due to what the Fed has lent the banks. So the money flows from the banks to corporations generally. So what do the corporations do with the money? The corporate borrowing has gone almost 100% into buybacks of stocks. So buybacks are the yellow line. And buybacks have been more than the total net sales of shares, which is the red line. So in other words, the corporations have been buying their own shares back, while the rest of the world has actually been selling shares on net. So the second stage of the flow is from corporate borrowing to buybacks. Now, of course, who gets that money? It's the people who own the shares. Who are the people who own the shares? Well, it's overwhelmingly a combination of institutions, in other words, the financial companies that borrowed the money, that got the money from the Fed in the first place, and extremely rich individuals. So what we see is the annual increase in US capitalist wealth. This is the wealth of individuals. And it's been doing great since the crash. The crash interfered with the accumulation only in this brief period. And then accumulation continued at a rate of approximately $5 trillion per year. This is total assets of the very wealthy, and then has shot up during the pandemic period to a rate of about 25 trillion. So this enormous gusher of wealth, now this is more than the Fed has lent, because through the magic of leverage, about $1 invested in stocks becomes about $10 in stock equity. In other words, the value of stocks increases much more rapidly than the amount of money funneled into the stock market. So you have this multiplier effect, and this enormous gusher of money is now flowing into the hands of the very rich, mostly the billionaires and the highest levels of the multimillionaires. So this has created this enormous inflation. Why didn't this happen back in 2009, 2012? First of all, the scale of the financing of capitalism has changed. Back a year ago, I showed some of these slides to describe the new phase of world capitalism, which I described, some others have described as state-financed capitalism, in which the major source of funds for capitalism comes from governments. So 2008 was basically a transition to this, where private investment in government greatly increased as opposed to private investment in the private economy, because it was becoming unsafe for private investors to invest in the private economy. Government investment in the private sector became 15% of the total, a very significant subsidy in which the government was financing a very significant fraction of the total investment in the private sector. In the post-pandemic period, the pandemic and the post-pandemic period, if we are in the post-pandemic period, this has shifted over, that almost all private investment is going to the government, because the government is now has become the only safe investment, while almost all investment in the private sector on net is coming from the government. So you get a government-mediated investment in which all of private capital is essentially funneled through the government, relieving the private investors of risk. And in addition, tax money, the government's own money, which ultimately comes from taxation of the working class, is also funneled to the private sector and has become the dominant source. So that's a change in scale. But there are other factors that led to inflation in housing that have changed since the crash. First of all, in the decade since the crash, there has been an enormous increase in a shortage of housing. First of all, investors who snapped up distressed housing, which was the result of sweeping defaults in the period of the housing crash, in many cases, physically destroyed that housing. We saw that very dramatically in the Midwest, in which houses that had been foreclosed on were simply allowed to decay and then were demolished. In addition, if you look at the construction of housing in the past decade has been way below household formation. So many more households have formed and housing has been constructed. So there's a real shortage of housing, or there was a real shortage of housing then, but the housing shortage is much exacerbated, making it possible for housing prices to escalate very rapidly. In addition, there was during the pandemic real wage increases, and not only wage increases, increases in workers' income from the pandemic subsidies. So that created a situation in which mortgages were being paid, rent was being paid, in contrast to the situation in the crash of 08, in which people simply didn't have the money to pay the mortgages. Therefore, houses were foreclosed and in many cases dumped onto the market. So all of this makes for a general inflation in housing. And it makes for a tremendous incentive for the capitalists to take back the real wage increases that did occur during the pandemic. And this gives you a picture of what's happening. This is the government figures for US real weekly wages, an index. And what you see here, this is over the entire last more than a half century, is you originally reached a peak in wages in the wake of the radicalized upsurge of the 1960s and the early 1970s. And then there was a big counterattack. We can go into that in the discussion, which led to a sharp fall in wages through the 60s and the 70s. There was a recovery somewhat in the 90s and in the early part of the 20th century. But the key thing was there was an enormous spike during the pandemic due to a real shortage of labor. So many people were out sick, and to that shortage of labor translating into a shift in class power so that workers could demand higher wages and know that the employers really had no choice but to yield them. Now, we don't want to exaggerate the extent of these increases. This was an approximately 8% increase in real wages during the pandemic. Whether they really reached the point that they matched the wages of 70 years ago, the wages of people's grandparents, is dubious because it depends on exactly how the inflation rate is determined in all these decades. But what we do know is the counterattack through inflation has wiped out those gains. So there's been an 8% fall in wages in the United States since the peak during the height of the pandemic. So this is the class warfare that's being waged mainly, and the most significant weapon is the escalation in housing prices, a direct effect of what the Fed has done. So clearly, what is this? The immediate solution to this is for the Fed to dump the bonds. I'm not talking right now about what would be needed politically to get the Fed to do this. I'm talking strictly about what is needed economically to stop the inflation in housing. The Fed has started a tiny amount of selling of bonds. There has been a 1% drop in US bond holdings in 3 months. During that period, the stock market has dropped by 10%.
Wow.
There is absolutely no question that if the Fed did what it legally can do, which is simply say, we're offering all of our 3 trillion holdings for shares right now, the bond market would simply melt down and the stock market would melt down to essentially nothing. And because of the hedging and the leverage involved in the bets that BlackRock, JP Morgan, and the other financial giants who dominate both the stock market and the bond market, those companies would be absolutely bankrupt. They would probably be bankrupt by the time 10% of this holdings have been sold. The proof of that is turn back the clock only 2.5 years to March of 2020, before this latest round of bond buying began. And as the stock market tanked in expectation of the major shutdowns of the economy that was coming, what happened? The bond market and the leveraged bets, the hedge fund bets that were based on it evaporated, and the Fed concluded that they were within days or perhaps hours of the bankruptcy of BlackRock, JP Morgan, and essentially all of the too big to fail financial institutions. So what would happen, again, in our hypothetical case, if they dumped the bonds? All of these giant financial institutions would fail within days and would be legally, necessarily seized by the Fed, which has the statutory obligation to take control of bankrupt financial institutions. Since the top 24 financial firms, that's the big banks, the big pension funds, the big insurance organizations, and the big hedge fund investment funds like BlackRock, own 70% of the top 500 US companies. All of those giant corporations would also become the legal property of the United States government. So you would have both the wiping out of this enormous fictitious capital of the bond market and the stock market, and the transfer of the heights of the controlling heights of the economy to the national government. Wiping out this fictitious capital equals stopping housing inflation. Most, not all, but most of billionaires' capital would be eliminated. That eliminates the flow of funds. There are no funds available for the corporate housing grabs, and that would stop housing inflation pretty much cold. Now, we would not expect housing prices to fall much because, again, people wouldn't be forced to put their houses on the market, because this would be an evaporation of this fictitious demand for housing. There wouldn't be any change in the supply. There would still be a shortage. However, this would free up enormous money for a massive government housing program. And a massive government housing program, which is one of the basic demands of the independent electoral program that many of us adopted during the summer, is the only way to solve that housing shortage and make housing affordable for everyone in the country. Well, people ask, if you wipe out all this fictitious capital, what happens to my 401k? What happens to my pension fund? Obviously, those would be wiped out too. But since 80% of the stock market is owned by the top 1% of the population, the 401ks of the majority of the population amounts to a very small amount of the market. And the federal government could simply roll those 401ks into Social Security, which could be substantially expanded. Now, the other side of this equation is who else is subsidizing the banks? And the international banks, many of which, but not all of which, are based in the United States, are subsidized not only by the United States government, they're subsidized by governments all around the world, especially in the emerging markets, as they call it, the developing countries, the poorer nations, that have borrowed trillions of dollars from these banks. The governments have borrowed them and are paying them back at elevated interest rates. The crisis that is occurring throughout the world, and we're seeing the effects of that in countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Iran, many other countries, is that as the Fed is escalating interest rates, these international debts become more and more unpayable. And through the IMF and other international institutions that are dominated by the United States, the governments are imposing severe austerity to fund the payment of the debt, ultimately to these international banks. So while the Fed rate is squeezing the US workers indirectly by increasing unemployment, and you see these great quotes from Powell, oh yes, this will be painful. We're going to have to increase unemployment to get inflation down. Why do we need to increase unemployment? Well, we need to decrease the pressure from wages. But wait a minute, wages are actually rising slower than inflation. So what Powell is talking about for American workers is your wages are going to decrease faster because more of you are going to be unemployed. And that's the pain that we all have to endure to ensure that there isn't a meltdown in the capital markets. In the case of foreign workers, the connection is much more direct because the huge increases in interest rates means the governments are transferring a huge proportion of their budget into debt payments and are directly slashing services to workers, slashing education, slashing food subsidies, slashing fuel subsidies, slashing health services. Around the world, the equivalent to dump the bonds in the developing countries is dump the debt, debt abrogation. The governments, mass movements forcing governments around the world to say, we're not paying this debt. We're not renegotiating it. It's just off the books. Now, individual countries doing that can be severely punished by the international financial community, essentially embargoed. But if this becomes an international movement of debt abrogation on the part of many countries, you have the same effect. Eventually that leads to a market meltdown because the major international banks become insolvent. So to turn briefly to the other main question is the price of energy. So this is a graph of global energy prices, which are mostly dominated by the price of petroleum. So what you see, of course, is a huge peak leading to the crash of 2008. So one of the contributing causes was a gigantic transfer through oil prices of wealth from the world working class to the owners of the oil companies. And the owners of the oil companies and the owners of the banks turn out, and those boards of directors turn out to be, lo and behold, the exact same individuals. So this was unsustainable, and the price declined swiftly after the crash of 08, 09. But this was only possible because of the ongoing war in Iraq. What you see happening again here is with the ending of the wars in the Middle East, it became impossible to sustain an artificially high price of petroleum. This is still a fairly high price compared with the cost of production in most of the world. But to be really elevated, it needs wars. And we saw this again. This was the meltdown before the March 2020 bailout by the Fed. This was the recovery in which part of two things happened. One is Putin and the Saudis made up, and with the mediation of Donald Trump, agreed to major restrictions in production. But second of all, some of this huge flow of money from the Fed flowed into commodity speculation. So commodity speculation started to push up the price of oil. But we could not get to the very high levels that we saw over the past year until there was another war, which is the war in Ukraine. So even though Ukraine is not an oil-producing country, and production in Russia was not seriously affected, the boycott, sanctions, and tensions were able to push commodity speculation still higher and was able to sustain this brief but very sharp rise in the price of oil. Now, again, they're finding, because production did not initially decrease, that's very difficult to sustain. And now Russia and OPEC are again resorting to constriction in production. So again, the question is, how do we get away from this enormous increase in the price of energy that has happened repeatedly? Well, obviously, dumping the bonds will help a lot because speculation in commodities would be heavily impacted, to say the least. But we have to get away from the very real underlying shortage of energy. The short-term shortages of energy are fake. They're controlled, they're created deliberately and openly by the constrictions on production by OPEC plus Russia. But the underlying energy shortage is real because to provide everyone with a good standard of living, we would have to approximately triple world energy consumption. That's the real shortage, because with fossil fuels, that's impossible. We're producing 14 billion tons of fossil fuels, which directly cause 7 million deaths from fossil fuel air pollution, $5 trillion in energy costs. I won't go into it in detail, but solar and wind are far too expensive as baseload sources. The only source of energy that can break the fossil fuel monopoly is fusion power. Fusion power is the energy that drives the sun and all the other stars. Fusion energy, fuels, are 1 million times more energy dense than fossil fuels. So in other words, we would be burning thousands of tons of fuel a year for the entire world rather than billions. And the most advanced fuels, and full disclosure, those are the research project that I work on, would have no radioactive waste and be safe enough to be sited in neighborhoods. So in addition to what we're talking about with dumping the bonds, we need a crash research and development to get fusion online in this decade. Well, all that sounds very nice, but how do we get there from here? And I think that it takes, if we look back in history, it takes 4 overlapping steps, some of which have been taken, some of which have never been taken. Right now, we are in an ideological war, and that a war has become acute since the beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago. On the one side are the forces of fascism, trying to divide the working class into factions split along national, ethnic, and religious lines, so that the capitalists can impose their own program. Our task is to make workers conscious of their common interests, development of common program and common demands arrived at democratically and spread throughout the entire world working class. That's the stage that we're really at. But at the same time, that can only happen when people see that this could become practical, because they see the strength of collective action through a mass strike movement. We see that mass strike movement developing in embryo in the strike waves that are starting to build in the advanced sector, but especially in mass strikes that are sweeping over sectors of the emerging countries. And I'll talk a little bit more. The current example that's most prominent is that in Iran. These mass strikes will lead and are leading to partial victories, to concessions that convince people that by acting as a class, they can move ahead and start solving the current crisis that confronts all of us. From those mass movements, mass strike movements, must arise mass organizations of the working class as a whole. Workers' councils, what we call delegated democracy. So far as we know, that hasn't happened, but we know from history, from such as the last big period of radicalization in the 1960s, that these workers' council strikes committees will emerge. And finally, what obviously we haven't seen is the stage of actually revolutionary transformation, in which in mass strikes behind common demands, the workers' councils start assuming the direction of economy and society. All of these steps, of course, I listed them as 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're overlapping and interacting as a process that Rosa Luxemburg described very eloquently a century ago in her pamphlet, The Mass Strike. To take the example of this process going on in Iran, we can see over the past several years, over a period of really a decade, protests have escalated from specific protests about election fraud, specific economic protests against reductions in government subsidies, specific protests against broader policies like the privatization going on in the economy. And now this year, we see that opposition merging into an overall opposition to the theocracy, to the plutocracy, which people recognize as the same thing, that the theocratic regime has become simply a disguise for the same capitalist plutocracy that rules throughout the world. So the shift to broader slogans, the mullahs must go, the broad demand, women, life, liberty, has led to a period which has not ended of mass demonstrations, of strikes, and now of occupation starting in the university, and I suspect will spread to the factories and workplaces. As far as I know, obviously there are communications problems getting through to people in Iran. We haven't seen the emergence of mass strike committees in which entire cities are organized under the leadership of workers' committees. And we haven't really seen the explicit linking of the political demands, which now affect the entire regime, with specific economic demands, the undoing of the privatization and so on. But the fact that we see such movements, and we've seen them in smaller countries like Sri Lanka, the crisis that eventually led to civil war in Burma, Myanmar, this is something that is going to continue and grow and gives the possibility of unifying the working class on a global scale. So to conclude, in terms of what we can do as small groups of activists, first of all is to encourage the emergence of common demands. The ILN recently expressed support for the demand of the Rail Workers United, which is a cross-union rank-and-file caucus demanding the nationalization of the North American railway system. These demands that do link political and economic concerns will be becoming more common, and it is the job of socialist activists to spread these demands throughout the working class. One way of doing that, as Jay mentioned, is independent electoral action around a common program. It certainly hasn't become a wildfire this year, but it can become a way of educating masses of individuals about common program. And finally, we have to have the setting up of more intersector and international workers' committees, planning in advance solidarity actions that can happen when one sector goes into action. For example, solidarity committees in the United States between rail workers and truckers to, if there is a rail strike, to make such a strike more effective. In addition, at the propaganda level, we need study groups so that we can make our own the knowledge that we share. People have to get comfortable with this knowledge and be able to spread it in their workplaces, in their neighborhoods, in their schools. We're starting to plan next week an international teach-in about common program. We're going to be inviting people, hopefully from the countries that are most in action, in motion, and starting to prepare the way for maybe next year conferences that could arrive at common and international program. And that will gradually move from individual demands to common demands, to the common realization that dumping the debt, dumping the bonds is only possible if we dump the plutocracy and assume ourselves through organizations that arise in conflict, the direction of society. That is ultimately going to be the only way out of the crisis of which inflation is currently one of the main symptoms. So I've run way over time, so I'll end there and open it up for discussion.